Hey everybody, welcome back. We are on to the topic of deriving meaning in art. I've already mentioned on our content page the 5 areas we'll discuss in deriving meaning from an art experience. They include formal analysis, content analysis, influence of historical context, location and surroundings, and method of encounter. How about writings about art? And finally, what do you think? So you encounter a work of art in architecture. How did their creators want what they made to connect with you, their audience? Where do you begin analyzing its makeup or subject? How does when and where it was made impact an art encounter? How do what others have written about art impact thinking about art, past and present? And what are your thoughts about the matter? What do you think? So these are some of the areas we'll talk about in our final unit. And let's begin with this mini video lecture talking about formal analysis and content analysis. All right, I thought we would do something a little fun and pivot away from traditional history of architecture and move on to something a little bit more familiar as we talk about the topic of formal analysis. So things to consider with formal analysis: how are its elements of what you're looking at, whether it's art or architecture? How are the elements arranged to form a composition? Also to wonder, what are its forms and their arrangement? Formal analysis is what is expected of every student of art history. And these are some of the questions you would ask. Looking at something familiar to most of us, if you've been to Anaheim and Disneyland, you may have noticed the Haunted Mansion ride. Perhaps you've gone on it a few times. It was completed back in 1969 and is a great way to kind of practice our skills at formal analysis. So let me begin by talking about its elements and how they are arranged in the architectural composition. This appears to be a large-scale home made up of 3 stories. You can see that here, 1, 2, 3. Of course, we know there's a subterranean level, don't we, whose size exceeds the seeming footprint or foundation perimeter of the main house. But the main entrance is centrally located. Here's the main entrance, with elements existing symmetrically on its left and right sides, like the shuttered windows and the wraparound porches that reach up 2 levels. So again, flanking each side in a symmetrical, balanced way are the 2 porches. The soaring entrance is capped with a triangular pediment that's borrowed from Greek temple design, and is supported by 4 columns, also a little bit of throwback to antiquity. And the columns provide a strong vertical emphasis to the front entrance and underscore its grand scale and mansion level status. The ornate ironwork that creates additional window-like effects, or perhaps suggests twining vines. You can see that ornate ironwork up here and down below as well, is evocative of the kind of ironwork one finds in the American South of the 18th and 19th centuries, where such details are common, especially in places like New Orleans, which is the theme of this part of Disneyland Park. It is called New Orleans Square, right? All right, so that is a breakdown of the elements of the Haunted Mansion from the exterior, how they are arranged in the architectural composition, and a discussion of some of the forms in their arrangement as well. Let's move on to something else in our topic of formal analysis. And that is something that comes from the Aztec people of Mexico. This is a Tlaloc vessel from circa 1440, made up of clay and pigment. It's about 14 inches in height. Overall, it's designed vertically with horizontal accents. So you can see here it's got a height to it vertically, but there are elements that go horizontally across it. The face that appears on it makes up the bottom half, with its features made up of geometric forms like cubes, ovals, and triangles. So you can see the ear spools are in the form of cubes, the eyes are circles, the mouth is an oval, the nose triangular. The top half is made up of a cup-shaped vessel. Horizontal elements include the red band along the cup's rim. Right here, it's a little bit in shadow, but you can see a bit of a red band there. Handles of the cup, whose stripe details kind of makes a implied line from one end of the piece to the other. And the braided band delineating the two halves. So at the top of the head, you have this braided band look that divides the top from the bottom. The main colors are blue and earthen brown. So whether the haunted mansion or this Aztec ritual vessel, their symmetrical organization is something they both have in common and results in a pleasing result that's easy to describe and understand in terms of elements. Let's move on to content analysis. So content addresses the artwork's theme or message, and things to consider in that regard include subject matter. We will also talk about symbolism and iconography, but let's get into subject matter first with a mixed media artwork by Donna Schlesier. It's called Setting Cycles from 2004, made up of oil pastels, handmade paper, papyrus, and thread. So her mixed media work, Setting Cycles, seems to be a purely non-objective artwork, meaning no real-world references, unlike abstract art, which does have some. However, it still has a subject. Contrasts of dense versus empty or neutral areas, geometric versus organic forms, colorful versus neutral areas as well. Then its title may lead the viewer to interpret different ideas. Perhaps gazing at it, you think of celestial bodies, a setting moon or sun with a spherical form. Perhaps you think of the seasons. Perhaps you think of life and death with all these dualities that are part of the overall themes of the piece. So as you can see, it's visually interesting, but it can also elicit a lot of complex themes based on focus on subject matter. Continuing on with content analysis and considering subject matter, this is a painting you may be familiar with already, Edward Hopper's Nighthawks from 1942. This artwork seems to be one thing initially, but upon further consideration of its elements, it leads to other underlying ideas or messages, known as subtext, which you may be familiar with from your English lit classes. The painting shows the nighttime view into a city diner common in the 1940s, with a counter, a soda jerk, the old fashion term for the employee who worked behind the counter, and a handful of patrons. However, the emptiness of the city street, the small number of customers who don't even seem to interact with one another, suggest another theme of loneliness in a big city. Thinking about the U.S. at this time in history, the attack in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor the year before changed the country's involvement from that point forward. There was no turning back from such a commitment to war, and perhaps Hopper didn't include an entrance or an exit door to suggest the idea of being entrapped or being surrounded. Continuing with content analysis, content and artwork's theme or message, we're now considering symbolism and iconography. That includes something called metaphor, an element that describes some other idea or concept. In Donna Schlesier's Setting Cycles painting we looked at earlier, the artist layers paper as a metaphor of the passage of time, much like layers exist in nature, on earth, tree rings, etc. In Lorna Simpson's Easy to Remember, the media installation we examined in our earlier part of this unit, the closed lips humming are metaphors for repression. Now, symbols are an image or element that represents some other entity or concept. Symbols can be affected by culture or by context. A dove can mean peace on a flag. So politically, it has that interpretation. However, in a church altarpiece that you see on the right, a dove can represent the Holy Spirit. There's a small dove right above here in this large-scale altarpiece. So its interpretation in Christianity is different. Symbols are increasingly universal in our modern world and heavily appear in airports, train stations, tourist destinations as efficient visuals communicating important information understood by most people. Just think about the symbols that direct us to, gender-appropriate restrooms. Iconography involves a broader system of symbols. A religion like Christianity is full of them, whether doves or unicorns or lambs to symbolize Christ. There's a sacrificial lamb here symbolizing Christ, or lily flowers or white objects to symbolize Mary's purity. Here we have the U.S. Capitol building, begun in 1793. This is a famous building that is abundant in iconography. The columns and pediment are evocative of ancient Greek temples, ancient Greece being the origin of democracy. The vast and long-lasting Roman Empire also emulated Greek architecture and mastered the dome, which you can see here, which as one of the structure's main focal point symbolizes the power but also unity, as the domed cupola here anchors the two houses of Congress. So abundant symbolism dating all the way back to ancient Greece, connecting the values of American government to the democratic origins in ancient Greece. Very good. I'll talk to you again very soon.